Tonight we have another native-born New York filmmaker, John Sayles. Born in Schenectady and began his career working as a writer at the legendary LA independent low-budget feature shop headed by Roger Corman. He's got an interesting kind of narrative about his filmmaking because he was a writer at the Corman Studios, and using his earnings from his writing, scripts, he financed and produced and directed on his own his first feature, the Secaucus 7, back in 1979, correct? And it was all shot within one house with friends and colleagues. And I think the film inspired a whole new generation of independent feature filmmakers and made them all feel that, in fact, not only could they make their own films, but find ways to find audience for those films. Following Secaucus 7, he made 2 more films and introduced the public to many new actors and innovative ways to telling stories and approaches to storytelling, and also marketing strategies that further opened the door for independent filmmakers and the work that you see and their ability to bring their work to the big screen as well. In 1993, he received a MacArthur Genius Award, and as one would expect an independent producer to do, he used much of that money to finance his next film, and it'll be the feature that we will see today, A Brother from Another Planet. Which, to his credit, became a major box office hit, and as a crossover film, and it captured the nation's imagination and curiosity about race and class, and brought unexpected audiences. And I remember, because I remember going to see the film, unexpected audiences coming together to watch a film together across the nation. He then went on to write and direct many more films, but to date he's written and directed and edited 18 of his own films since his 1979 beginning. His most recent, Sofa Sisters, recently premiered at the 2013 South by Southwest Film Festival, and keep that title in mind because it's going to be in theaters soon, and I'm sure John would love all of you to come and see his film once it's in New York. He is an author of books, short stories, screenplays, and I feel very strong because I kind of went to California in 1980 and was very impressed by and affected by those who were coming out of the Corman Studios. But I think John, unlike others, has really been an inspiration and had such an amazing influence on the independent film community. And in some way was very much responsible for what we might call an independent film movement. Has been one of the most influential and respected voices in the industry because of the way in which he works and the kinds of films that he makes, and the fact that his films really follow his own heart and his own interests. His dedication to his work and the honesty of his voices made him more than a trailblazer, really. And he has become an example of how important and essential the non-conformist can be in the universe of ideas, in creativity, and in progress. And that these kinds of people are the ones who not only change the rules, but change the world and the space for everyone who follows after them. So it's with great pleasure and admiration, I'd like to invite John to the AtriumFlix stage. And of course, there's nothing like the AtriumFlix talk without the interrogator and the questioner. And today we have joining us on stage film critic and film lover John Anderson. John is an independent voice as well, whose opinions and views can be seen in newspapers and magazines like Variety and Newsday, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and American Magazine. He is, in my mind, and for most of us in the field, one of the most respected voices commenting on independent work these days, and his work has been called insightful, respectful, and enormously entertaining. John and John, thank you.
Thank you, Orlando. So, you're known as a storyteller. You're also known as a very political filmmaker. I've always wanted to ask you whether your films have been inspired by politics, or have the politics arisen out of the story?
You know, I really can't, separate them, just as I think you can't separate politics out of people's life. There's electoral politics, and that's its own kind of circus show. But politics are sexual politics, they're economic politics, they're cultural politics. And I've often said that in the movies that I've made as a director, not so much the ones I've written for other people, I really don't want to go all the way around to avoid the neighborhood if there's things that really affect recognizable human behavior in the economics of the time and place, in the cultural clashes of the time and place. So much of what a Hollywood screenwriter does when they're working on a genre piece is to take all those things out because they get in the way of the story flow, and and then they may sneak them back in, but in a very kind of disguised, allegorical way. Whereas in my movies, if it's set in West Virginia in 1920, that's part of the character of what's going on. The movie you're going to see tonight is really a science fiction movie in some ways, but it's also a trip to Harlem at a certain time in its history. And in our history together. So really the story comes, but with it, the story gets more interesting when you know why the people are doing what they're doing.
Well, I was speaking to someone who was involved in the new Star Trek movie, and they mentioned, it's definitely an allegory for terrorism and suicide bombing. And I was so taken aback because usually I'm looking for that.
Yeah.
And I so did not expect to find it there. Where have politics gone, do you think, in mainstream motion pictures?
Well, in mainstream motion pictures, I think they just look at the box office of the things that are overtly about something like the Iraq War or whatever, and if the box office is good, you see a lot more of those movies and it's encouraged. And if it's not good, they say, well, is there something that's really an action film that we could place there? I think that the allegorical thing is also, sometimes it's really there, and other times what it's there for is to give you structure. And it's great to, the only actual directing job Roger Corman ever offered me was to make Mutiny on the Bounty in outer space. And the movie that I had written for him already was basically The Seven Samurai in outer space. So very often the politics of the moment or the politics of 20 years ago or whenever can form a really nice structure for what's basically just another science fiction movie or a thriller or whatever.
Right. Well, it's funny. Orlando mentioned the return of the Secaucus 7, which was then sort of stolen for The Big Chill, and you're not owning up to this, or is that?
No, I've always felt like if I wrote a movie that had an Indian and a horse in it, and somebody else made a movie that had an Indian, I'm not going to say, they stole my idea. Yeah. I felt like Larry Kasdan probably looked and said, well, geez, my friends went through the 60s and we went in a very different direction. The Big Chill is called The Big Chill for a reason. It's about a bunch of people who have either lost their idealism or realizing they never had it in the first place. And the return of the Secaucus 7 is about people desperately hanging on to that idealism, even though it may make them somewhat downwardly mobile. So it actually is really, it's in the same genre, but they're very, very different movies thematically in a way. So in that way, I feel like there's been a bunch more. The 30-something, the TV series, there's been summer camp reunion movies and stuff like that. I actually got some of the idea for Secaucus 7 from a French movie called For Jonas Who Will Be 25 in the Year 2000, which was made in 1975, if you can do your math. I
wasn't born yet, so I don't.
Yeah. And so it's a small genre, but it actually is a genre.
Yeah. Well, when you're working, I mean, you've worked uncredited on lots of Hollywood stuff. I mean, Apollo 13 was one. Do you see that? I mean, The Big Chill would be an example of just taking your idea and flipping it, and you see that pretty regularly, where an idea is just
It's most of the movies that are made today are taking an idea or a genre that's been before and flipping it, and now they actually would like it to be based on something that people know. It's called underlying material, and it's great if it was a movie that people, Newsies has been playing on Broadway for how many years? And it's based on a financially unsuccessful movie that Disney made.
Right.
But somebody saw it and said, well, maybe this would work better as a musical. And I think, that's been the movie business since its inception, is to take a book, The Last of the Mohegans, and there's been 6 different versions, including, silent versions, and let's just use that structure, but we have this star this time, or we've got better special effects this time. So it's a very, very common thing, and I think, whenever you write in genre, and I do it as, for a living, what you're looking for is, well, what hasn't been done, or what are the twists and turns, So when I worked for Roger Corman, a lot of what I did was, well, let's have characters who have actually seen a horror movie. So they don't just go into that house where 6 of their friends have been brutally murdered by a crazed person with an axe, and they say, oh, this is like a horror movie, let's not go in there.
right. Didn't that become Scream later on?
Later it became
Right,
Scream.
right.
Yeah.
Did you see the story in the Times last week about this outfit in LA that's analyzing screenplays? It's sort of like Moneyball. It's like you're taking all the stats and running them through the machine and seeing, if you're going to have a demon movie, it should be a targeting demon rather than a summoned demon. I mean, they're boiling it down to that kind of stuff and then telling screenwriters what they should have in their
Well, I think,
scripts.
the movie business is very volatile. It's easy to lose money in, and so if you're a studio and you're going to spend $20 to $100 million just advertising a product, the thinking has to be, well, why can't we get market research into the making of the thing so that we at least have a product that we can sell at the end of it? I don't think it necessarily makes for bad screenplay. Somebody could take all those limitations that they're given and do something interesting with them, but it doesn't necessarily even make for profitable movies, because everybody else is doing that same kind of, but it's not a science. Yeah. And it's just never going to be.
When you do to sort of get off.
Although I have to add, Roger Corman, when I worked for him, the one thing that he did that was like that is he test marketed titles. He didn't bother with a movie. So the first movie I wrote for him, Piranha, he had test marketed that title after Jaws came out, and it went through the roof.
Was that Piranha 3D, or was that?
That was Piranha 1.
Okay.
That's the only one I had anything to do with.
Because I prefer Piranha 3D myself. When you do this kind of work, just to get off of the Hollywood thing, is it strictly to make your own movies? Yeah.
I like screenwriting. It's a better job than it pays better than any other job I've had, and I like the people I work with, and it's interesting work, but you're basically an employee. So one of the things that, the way that, the Writers Guild and the way that credit goes in the Writers Guild is that you may never hear of the other writers who've already been on the project until it's ready to go on the screen, and then the Writer Guild will contact and say, well, here are the 15 writers, and it's been as high as 15 writers who worked on this project. Here's who they say they're going to give it credit to. You're not included. Would you like to be included? Write us a little statement about why you should be included. And the rule of thumb is if you change the script 40%. So I always say if you made it 40% worse, you get credit, but 39% better, you don't get credit.
Right.
And sometimes, quite honestly, in the last 10 years, I've more often asked, don't put my name on this, because I don't feel like I deserve it, or I don't want to take the rap for it in some cases.
Right.
Then do let it. But it's kind of like being a football player who's, like he's brought in for a series of downs, and you realize you may gain a lot of yardage, but you may not be there for the touchdown. So what you're trying to do as an employee is get them closer to the green light to get the movie made. And, and then the chips fall where they may. And when I see movies that I've worked on, every once in a while there's one I say, that's really great. You know, I'd like to have my name on that, you know, whether it's on it or not. And other times it's, well, too bad. You know, it could have been better.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you've been quoted as saying you actually work harder for other people's scripts than you.
Oh yeah, I do many more drafts for other people's scripts because it's, you know, it's not just a creative situation, it's a political situation. So, you know, as I said, you're auditioning all the time to get the people who say yes to say yes. So there's things that you put in the screenplay that are basically selling the screenplay. You know, I with Joe Dante, who directed a bunch of movies for Roger Corman and a couple that I wrote, I remember him walking out of a meeting with some executives once who had made some really dumb comments that they wanted in the screenplay. And he said, if you promise to write those, I promise not to shoot them. Because politically, they had to be there at least in the next draft, but he knew that they would ruin the movie, so he defined a way for them to be scheduled out of existence.
Right, right. People in my racket generally go by the rule that the more screenwriters credited, the worse the movie's going to be.
It could be that way, although sometimes what happens, I wrote a couple drafts of The Mummy, when the modern one, not the 1934 one. When Joe Dante was going to be the director, and it was going in a totally different direction than when the remake finally came out. And I think and that was one where there were 15 writers on including George Romero twice, 11 years apart. So I assume he just handed in the same script and said, you know, this is the best I can do. But then somebody came with a totally different take on it. So really, that movie only had 2 writers, and I think there were a team. And it was pretty good. But they just kind of said, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, this is what we're going to do. So it's hard to say whether all those writers get credit, their writers get credit, with very little to do with the final product. They were just in the room at the right time.
Let me ask you about some of your movies specifically. We were talking before about the politics and how the politics arise in the storyline. Something like 8 Men Out, which I always kind of see as a labor story.
Yeah, I had read a long prose poem by Nelson Algren, a Chicago writer, and in it he had some footnotes, and he quoted Elliot Azanoff's book, 8 Men Out. And I was a baseball fan growing up, and I was fairly young at this point, and I read Elliot's book, and I said, what a story. You know, it's not only what a baseball story, but what a labor story, what a human story. And actually the thing that it reminded me the most of that I had seen was the Watergate, the whole Watergate situation and the various things that were made from that, all the President's Men and various things that were written about it. Because it was about a conspiracy, and why most conspiracies don't work, because at some point the people are ashamed of what they're doing and they don't have enough meetings. So they don't, and truly the White Sox, when they decided to throw this, they had one meeting that everybody was at. The next one, only about half the guys were at. So people were literally on the ball field going, are we supposed to just lose this game or the whole series? And it was unclear who was getting paid by who and when, and so the thing was a huge mess. And like a lot of huge messes, like a lot of our foreign policy, you start down that road and it's impossible to turn back. So that was a situation where I had already been a fiction writer. My second book was sold by a literary agent who their agency had a deal with a film agent. And I said, well, give me that guy's phone number. And I called up and they said, well, I'd like to write screenplays. And they said, oh, well, congratulations. But send something you've written. And I had just read Eliot's book and I adapted it I didn't have the rights or anything, but just as something to show. And I sent it out to LA, and it turned out that Everett Ziegler, the head of that agency, had been Elliot Azanoff's literary agent 25 years earlier when he sold that book. And he said, you did a great job, kid, you'll never make this fucking thing. There's a curse on it. And then, so I put it aside, and then 11 years later, I got to make it. So, I literally started with my 3x5 card of my dream cast with Martin Sheen at third base and ended up with Charlie Sheen in center field.
And then like 3 years later, somebody made Field of Dreams, right?
Well, and they used our uniforms in Field of Dreams.
Was that
some things do get recycled.
Was that Kasdan too? I don't remember.
Pardon?
Was that who directed Field of Dreams? Because I think he's stalking you. I'm not sure.
No, it wasn't Kasdan. Actually, Larry had made a couple movies that thematically are very. He made one called The Great Divide or something. Just when the Yeah, Grand Canyon, right when I had, City of Hope out, and there was a
Right.
review in Mexico that said, if John Sayles is the venom, es el veneno, Larry Kasdan is the antidote. And we have been both quoted as saying that we learned everything we know about style from Roberto Clemente, who was a right fielder for the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Sure.
So there is some, we're almost the same age, so there is some kind of thing going on there.
Going the other way, you and I'm not trying to sandbag you with this, but we had an interview years ago around the time Lone Star was coming out. And I had remarked to you about the echoes that I heard in Lone Star of Peter Matheson's Killing Mr. Watson. And you had said, I think at the time, that you had written a version of Killing Mr. Watson for the screen.
Yeah, I had written it for a 3-part miniseries, and that never got made, like most things you write. Many are called, but few are produced. And but that had been, the first book anyway is very cinematic. It would have been a great role for Tommy Lee Jones. I wish they had snapped him up and made it. But I had actually come to that after I had come back to the Lone Star story, which was actually came out of, I think it was a New Yorker article about corruption on the border and how hard it was, to stay honest on either side of the border when the drug money was starting to come in. And when we started doing our research for Lone Star, we would call up these border counties in Texas and try to get the sheriff on the phone, and half the time, literally half the time, is, well, sheriff's indicted right now, so he's not talking to anybody. And we've had that happen before, where I've written a screenplay, and then the headlines start coming out, and it's like they read my screenplay. City of Hope was the most notable one, which is about corruption in New Jersey. And I wrote the screenplay just out of my head, and I said, I should really go back and change. So I started reading the Hudson Dispatch and the Jersey Journal, and like every week there was another headline right out of my screenplay.
Well, it was set in like Union City, though, right?
Well, it was called Hudson City, but it was basically a Jersey city near New York. So there were very small stakes, but people were really fighting over the crumbs, to the death.
Yeah, I worked at the Passaic Herald News at one point.
Yeah.
Filthy business,
Yeah.
New Jersey. Yes,
Yeah.
But the Lone Star device was the telling of the story kind of backwards, right? Right, that was the thing. The other, I would, of course, you can't think of Lone Star and not think of Chris Cooper. And when you think of Chris Cooper, you think of these actors with whom you've worked on such a regular basis. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I've been very lucky. Joe Morton, who's the lead in this, I worked with, I think, 3 or 4 times. Chris Cooper's first job in a movie was the lead of Matewan, which is, one of the advantages of making an independent movie is, if you're that marginal, people aren't saying, well, you have to get Jeff Bridges to do it or it's not happening or whatever, So we got to have, and some well-known actors came in to audition for it, and he was just the best guy for it. David Strathairn, who I went to college with, has been in maybe 7 of my movies. I've gotten to work with other people. Angela Bassett started, before she was well known, was in a couple of I think 3 of my movies now. Mary Steenburgen, I've gotten to work with a bunch of times. So yeah, what happens is eventually you work with people and you like working with them, and then I try not to think of the actors when I'm writing a screenplay, because they can't afford to work for me anymore, or they're busy, or they're not interested, or whatever. But then once you've got it done, the first thing you go is, well, who do I know who might even owe me a favor and be willing to work for scale again, who would be good for this? And that, I have often big ensemble casts, and it's like keeping a lot of balls in the air, like on the old Ed Sullivan show where they're playing saber dance. And every time you can take one of those balls, I know how he works and what he needs, and take them down, it takes a little of the pressure off. So that you've worked out with that actor what they need and what they don't want, and are they good on the first take or the 5th take or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, people who work together a lot often talk about developing a shorthand. Do you have that?
Yeah, I think so. It really what it is it's about I try to cast actors, especially actors I know, to play something I haven't seen them do before. So it's not a, we do talk about that particular person that they're playing, and that, I always write a bio for every character. So, I don't do rehearsals. We do blocking rehearsals on the day, but I don't even do a table read-through. So I send the actors a bio, and it can be, 4 or 5 pages if it's a big part, or half a page if it's a small part, to give them a little background on the character that's not in the thing. But really what that shorthand is about is I can kind of tell when the actor needs something, and they know they can always come to me. And they also, there's a comfort level that they have that has to do with making movies independently, and also that I'm the editor. So the deal they're making is with the writer, director, editor who has final cut. And so I say, go for the fence on this one, do something you think may be embarrassing, chew the scenery, if that's what I need to see if it can get us through to some other place without changing any lines. And I'll use your best stuff, and I'm the editor, and I have final cut. Whereas in a studio movie, the deal you're making is with the director, the editor, if they keep their job for the whole film, the producers, the focus group in Milwaukee, and and literally people have been almost cut out of movies that they were nearly the lead of because another actor got hot while they were editing the movie, and we need more close-ups of this actor.
Yeah, it's I've come to appreciate over the years how much a performance depends on the editor. Mm-hmm. Just the timing. I mean, the length of time that you linger on a face.
Yeah.
The
it's
audience.
The rhythm of the character.
Yeah.
And what you realize is as a director and sometimes as an audience, you always have the plan B. You have the dog to cut away to or whatever. Sometimes you get actors who aren't good at their lines. And so you're going to get the performance piece by piece. Yeah. But you will get it. If they're a good actor. But if you see Fred Astaire's dance routines, there's only 3 cuts in the whole thing. And the amazing thing is the camera's way back here, and he's doing all this stuff for a minute and a half or 2 minutes that we'd fall down dead if we could do, even if we could do those things, just the exertion of it. Right. Incredible stuff that he's doing, and that's what's amazing about that. You get into a dance film that has Bob Fosse, which is very, kind of cutty kind of choreography. Yeah. It's also very cutty. And the dancer only has to do this, and then it's, okay, let's go on to the next shot. Sure. So one of the things that you do as a director is there are actors who you just sit back and you try not to cut, because they're gonna do it, and they're gonna do big pieces of it. You have cuts, and so you can help them out. And then there's situations in actors where really it is a collaboration between the director, the actor, and the editor. And as I was saying, if they've been in a movie of yours before and they trust you not only as a director but as an editor, I often ask actors. Joe Morton, who was in Lone Star, there was a scene in that he's playing a colonel in the military, and he's having a crisis of faith. He's losing his faith in the military, and he's kind of falling apart. And there was a scene that he has with this young private, and she's gotten into trouble, but he's the one who's kind of shaky in the scene. And I said, Joe, you know what I need? I need one take where it's only subtext that you're really falling apart, and you just kind of, blast her out of here with good old military, know-how. One where the audience, because they know what's going on with you, starts to see a little crack. And a third where this young private goes out and says, what's his trip? What's wrong with him? And we're going to do this from 3 angles, so I need one of those from each 3 of those angles. And I will know in the editing room which way we're going to go, but I don't know yet. Now that's a lot of control to ask for an actor to have, but it's also mostly trust that, and knowledge as a film actor that you don't know until you put the movie together when to break the emotional information of this character falling apart. So often I ask actors to bracket a performance, and if an actor is defensive, if they have a persona that they don't want to leave, and there are big movie stars who are very good who never leave that persona, and they know that's where I'm safe and that's what my audience wants to see. But most of the actors I'm working with, they're saying, okay, well, if you want me to try for that, I'll try for that. and maybe it will get in the film and maybe it won't, but if that's what you need, I'll do it.
Yeah. I don't expect you to name names, but have there been occasions when an actor has just wanted to work with you and came in and just couldn't conform to the plan?
You know, there was one actor who I cast at the last minute in a fairly large part, and I just realized, you know what? He's not an American. And even though he had an American... And
So you called immigration, or what happened?
No, he had been raised in Ireland and Europe, and good actor, and I just had to reconceive the character. We didn't change a line, but and it was actually his physical self. You know, he just couldn't move like an American. He just didn't move like an American. And he hadn't been in many movies in that size of part before, and I said, I'm not going to throw this thing and redo his body language for him. So I'm just going to reconceive the character, but there's some very strong things that he's doing, so I'm going to go in that direction. And I've had a couple actors who have gotten to the point where they should be asking for cue cards, and they haven't. and then really the trick is to let nobody get fried even though you're going to do it 2 lines at a time, or frustrated if that's not appropriate for the scene. So then you really, I do all the acting, which is making it seem like it's not a big deal that we're taking 2 hours to shoot a scene that should take 20 minutes. And truly, that's a lot of a director's job. On a low-budget movie like this, 4 weeks we had to shoot Brother from Another Planet, the Gopher Sisters, which was mentioned before, the movie I shot this summer, 4 weeks to shoot it, is to give the actors the illusion that they have time to experiment and that, it's not a big deal if they start to blow their lines.
Does it help that you're an actor too? Or
Yeah, it does help.
Yeah,
Every day on the set is a performance of some point, and this is a performance, and advertising the film is a performance. But also just in, I'll act in other people's movies. I'll do a day player gig every once in a while, and I really like it because it makes me think, not only as a director of what was helpful for me coming on the set as a day player, from the person who greets you at the door to the director. Because the thing about a day player is, the minute you say your last line and they say cut and they're done with your scene, you're furniture and you're in the way because they're in a hurry. And then people may not even recognize you later in the day if you hang out, so you get out of it quick. But what's helpful? What makes the actor relax so they can do a good job? But also as a writer, so much of my writing, fiction as well as movie writing, is about, if this person is acting this way, what can possibly be going through their head? And that's one of the first things that you do as an actor when you look at, here's the written part, whether it's a play or a movie, what's going on inside? Why would he do that? And you try to build that so you can have something. You mentioned Chris Cooper before. One of the great things about Chris Cooper is he's somebody who can play a subtext and a text at the same time. So all the way through Lone Star, which is basically a mystery, he's the sheriff. He's trying to find out whether his father murdered some guy when his father was a sheriff. He's asking very kind of dragnet, where were you on the night of, October 27th, 1957? And he's really asking, what kind of human being was my father? And that's a really strong subtext. And Chris, in a very subtle way, kept that going for the length of the movie. And it adds so much to his character when it could have just been this flat guy who's going to wipe somebody out. One of the genres I've never worked in is the hitman genre. And there are so many hitmans and men in movies. It's like the other night we saw some TV show, and it was, what would the world do without dead hookers? I mean, the movie business, like half of the movies would disappear overnight. It'd be, like The Rapture or something like that.
Have you ever had a dead hooker in a movie?
No, we've had some live ones, but
That's right.
a couple live ones in this.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
I can't remember the movie, but I remember watching at a festival this Japanese film, and suddenly there was this American Air Force general, and it was you.
Yeah.
And the whole movie was in Japanese. I'm like, what?
No,
John Sayles is doing this movie.
Actually, it was not in Japanese. It was in another dialect they speak. What's the island? Okinawa. It was in Okinawan,
right. Okay, right.
which I don't speak. Luckily, I got to speak in English. And these guys, we had some of our early movies, including the brother, had played in Japan and done fairly well. And I'd somewhere met the producer of this movie. And he tried to get Marlon Brando to play this part. Couldn't get in touch with him. Then he tried Dennis Hopper, and then couldn't get him. And then he just said, well, I only know one other American, or of one, and so they got me, and it was a free trip to Okinawa. And it's actually a really cool movie, but there used to be a joke about Japanese movies that they had a beginning and end and 3 middles. This has about 7 middles.
Yeah. I don't remember going back and seeing it again, but
It's an avant-garde, it's the best avant-garde Okinawan movie I've ever seen.
Right. Well, I'd like to say that the language thing was a way of segueing into the next question that was just coincidental. That you're perhaps the only English-speaking American director making films, and maybe that's not true anymore. But I think when Men with Guns, it was the first Spanish language.
Yeah, Spanish and indigenous languages.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's been such a tradition in the other direction of, Michael Curtiz and all these, guys who escaped from Germany or Europe before World War II. There's still people who coming into, American film from Brazil and Argentina and stuff like that. They have, Lasse Hallström and people like that, and some of them come already speaking English, some it's coming along, but not quite there.
Yeah.
Mostly, I think that for me, the movies that I've made overseas, I don't feel comfortable. 2 of them were set in imaginary countries, imaginary South American countries, because I don't feel like I know the culture there and the politics there enough to really make a movie set there.
Yeah.
And then the third, Amigo, which is half in Tagalog, it's Americans in a foreign country, and it's the Philippine-American War. And so I felt like, okay, well, here's our chance, and most of my Filipino actors spoke fairly good English. Some of them excellent, better than my English. But I edited those movies without having done the subtitles. And it's an interesting thing. Tim Squires, who cuts for Ang Lee, he cut, a couple of Ang's movies that are all in one dialect of Chinese or another without the subtitles yet. And then Ang will go through and work with them. And so on Amigo, I cut all the scenes that were in Tagalog by emotion. I know what the scene's about because I wrote it, but I don't know literally what everybody's saying. And then my assistant editor, who speaks Tagalog, it's one of his languages, would listen very carefully and say, I think you've overlapped a syllable here or something like that. But I've directed people who don't speak English at all, sometimes in Spanish and sometimes through an interpreter. And there, and even auditioned people in those languages, what you're looking for is focus and emotion. And if somebody can get you, you give them a scene that has some emotion attached to it, and if you feel that emotion without even knowing what they're saying, you know something's happening there. Yeah. And one of the traps that movie directors can fall into is, they said all the words right this time. That's a good take, when in fact, you can, in post, in editing, get them to say all the words right by cutaways and putting, one line reading into the mouth of another performance. But if the emotional content is not there, it's not there. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can't actually get close enough to the actors because of all the camera stuff that's moving to feel that right away. So it's something that you'll only find in the editing room.
What's your, I wasn't thinking about this, but now you made me. Do you use a monitor on set?
We have a monitor, and I tend to look at it while we're setting up shots, if it's a moving camera shot, and then go away from it, because I want to be close to the actors. Usually what I have is a script supervisor is looking at it, and they're looking for things like, did the kid look in the camera, the extra, or did the boom come in, and those kind of things. Right. I don't need to look for that stuff. Somebody will tell me about it or whatever. Right. I really need to be there for the heat of the scene. Once I've seen with the cinematographer what the shot looks like, they'll tell me if the movement was good or not. And then every once in a while, if it's a very complicated move, like on our movie City of Hope, they're almost 10 or 11 long steady cam shots, 7 to 9 minutes long. And then, the steady cam operator says, I think that was pretty good, and you go and look at it and you judge it by movement and acting and stuff like that if there's not going to be a cut. So then I would use it. But generally, no, I think it's just like, why would I be watching TV if there's live theater in the room?
But directors do. I mean, it seems to be a philosophical
It's
divide.
crazy. If you go to you go to one of the most beautiful racetracks in America now, more than half the people aren't out in the stands. They're by the ticket window watching all the other races on a little monitor. And it's just crazy.
Right. Well, you do that at Madison Square Garden, right?
Yeah. We're watching the Diamond Vision.
It always felt to me like Men with Guns was kind of a political act as well as a dramatic.
You know, I don't think our movies get seen by enough people, and especially that kind of movie that I know. You know, there is a ceiling on subtitled movies in America. You know, less than 2% of American moviegoing is to subtitled movies. So it's a pretty quiet political act if you make a subtitled movie. So I didn't really expect. You know, it was a story I was interested in that couldn't be. You know, and it's a big decision to make. Are we going to have people pretend they're speaking Russian with Russian accents or British accents and have the upper class Russians speak with upper class accents or whatever we do? Or are we going to actually have people speak in another language that needs subtitles? Because Americans really don't like dubbing. And sometimes, and very often in my case, part of the story is about people being separated by the fact that they don't speak the same language. And so you can't just have somebody with an accent and the other person pretend they don't understand them. Right. You know, so it was a story that had to happen in that world. It was, you know, that was just where it took us. I mean, it's a story that's set in a imaginary Latin American country, but it's based on things that also happened in Africa, in Chechnya, in the former Yugoslavia. So I was taking incidents, you know, from all, and it has a very generic title, Men with Guns. Yeah. You know, and you could have made that movie, just like Amigo, which is about the Philippine-American War, could have been made in Nazi-occupied France, or French-occupied Vietnam, or Algeria under the French, or Vietnam under the Americans.
I don't think Brother from Another Planet could have been made anywhere but
no,
in New York City.
Harlem, USA.
Yeah.
And I think, and some of that is the idea that a real place is a character. And you find some of the character when you go up there. I mean, this was a movie, it was, we shot in 35 millimeter, which was a big deal for me. Ernest Dickerson was the first feature he'd shot in 35. He told me he'd shot a movie in 35 down in Curacao, and he just figured he'll never track this movie in Curacao down. It actually was 16, but it didn't make that, he did a great job. Yeah. And we had such a small crew. The heads of most of our departments were African American. My first AD was African American, the cinematographer, the head of the costumes, whatever. So you know, it's New York City. People got stuff to do. They got jobs to go to. So the first scene, we're on 125th Street, and you'll see. I did this thing of, I figured people aren't going to stop and watch us on 125th Street. They got stuff to do. You know, even if it's crazy stuff to do. So I sprinkled our extras who had things to say in various languages in with the real people. And at one point you'll see this guy in Puerto Rican Spanish yelling at his girlfriend up on the second floor of an apartment. And you see somebody look at him weird because there actually is no window in that building. And it's, well, just another crazy New Yorker. And quite honestly, Joe Morton in his outer space clothes, he just looked like another God-intoxicated crazy New Yorker to people, and they would just give him a look and walk by.
Sure. Did you shoot a lot of it? How did you? Things seem so different now when people shoot on location. Mm-hmm. They have to get releases from people. Any of that? I mean, did you bother with any of that stuff, or was it just guerrilla time?
At that point, we were so under the radar that we kind of knew about that stuff but didn't pay another attention. In our previous movie, Leanna, we had one scene that was called "How Many Lawsuits Can You See in This Picture?" You know, we had Mickey Mouse ears and all this Grateful Dead posters, all this kind of stuff that today we'd be in jail for. You know?
Right.
So really, we didn't worry too much.
I think
about
the guy
that.
from Disney is here. Actually.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't worry about that too much. We were very mobile. We had a lot to do in 4 weeks. So we, and as I said, Harlem was a real living community, and we just took what's going on there at the moment, and we used it in the scene. If it rained, all of a sudden, the brother from another planet shows up with a garbage bag over his head, and he's wet.
Right.
So we worked the rain into the thing. You always have to shoot something. You can't wait for the weather or the guy with a jackhammer. And our first day of shooting, which is this scene that you see on 125th Street and then in a Korean market, we showed up. The guy who was renting us the track to do the dolly shots decided he had a better offer and just didn't show up. So there goes the tracking shot. The kid who said he could do the appliances because the brother has these 3 toes didn't tell us, he can't either walk in them, he could just stand still in them. So I got 1 shot of those before they fell apart. There was a jackhammer there that had not been there on 125th Street, any of our scouts, and it went all day long. The location guy's wife was having their first baby, so our location manager was not there. And the station wagon that had all the props and stuff that we needed for the art department, they locked the keys into the station wagon. Very nice guy came along in a suit with a briefcase and said, well, I'm good at breaking into cars. So 125th Street. He helped us break into the thing. We got our keys, and while he was doing that, somebody stole his briefcase. So Maggie Renzi, the co-producer, who was our assistant location person on that day, had to go to the methadone clinic, because in that briefcase was his methadone, and say, I really saw a briefcase. It really did get stolen. He's not running a game on you. So by the time we got to the Korean market, we had no location people, and halfway through the scene, they said, we're losing too much business, because they were running customers as we were shooting, and they kicked us out. That was the morning. So the shoot was like that, but it was fun at the same time.
It sounds like a great making of film, which I guess...
Yeah, no, but the making of crew would have been bigger than our crew. So.
Right. It's funny when Bill Cobb, who's one of the barflies, he says, it's just not the same here in Harlem anymore. And that's, how many years ago now?
Yeah, he and Leonard Jackson, who plays his buddy Smokey in it, I had heard about because they had been at the O'Neill Theater thing doing Fences, one of the first production of Fences. Tom Wright, who plays a social worker, and I said, you got to get these 2 guys in, and I just saw him. I said, these are my bar guys, And Bill has been in, I got to work with him again in Sunshine State, but he's become a kind of staple of commercials, but also, wonderful character.
Yeah.
roles.
Was he the clock tender
He
in
was
that
a clock
Coen
tender in the
Brothers?
Coen Brothers,
Right.
Hudsucker Proxy, and a bunch of other things.
Right. He always plays the
Wonderful actor.
very droll guy.
Yeah.
And Joe Morton really gives maybe the best silent performance since...
You know what was
Buster
great
Keaton
is
or
is
something?
I had seen Joe on stage. He was basically a Shakespearean actor and a stage actor. And then he came in and told me a story about his family background. I said, this guy has been he grew up overseas because his father was in the military, and then he moved back to his mom's neighborhood in Harlem. And so he said, hey, I was the kid with a German accent on Sugar Hill, who everybody, didn't like all of a sudden. And he understood the part, plus he's a wonderful physical actor. And also, for all you wannabe filmmakers, if your lead doesn't speak, you get to shoot a lot of what's called MOS, which means you don't have to worry about sound.
Right.
And so, things go a lot quicker when you have to worry about sound in New York City.
Yeah, jackhammers.
Yeah.
What about the idea for the film? I mean, where did this come from?
This is the only movie that I got the idea from a bunch of dreams. We had been ready to go down to West Virginia and make Matewan, and then the financiers called us the day before we were getting on the airplane and said, you know that thing about the bank loan we were going to get to finance your movie? Well, they turned it down. So I was sitting around with Peggy Reisky and Maggie Renzi, the producers, and I had these 3 dreams. The first being that I was writing a movie for Joe Dante that was called, a science fiction film called Assholes from Outer Space. And, with a 3D type, assholes from outer space. And there were guys who came down, and they looked human except they had the little dilly bopper antenna, and they worked at the motor vehicle department, and they were assholes. And then I had another dream a couple of nights later that I was directing a movie that was basically a remake of Odd Man Out, but it was called Bigfoot in the City, and it was a Sasquatch loose in Seattle with a lot of, slick down, cobblestone streets and stuff like that. And I dreamed the last scene, which was the tough detective, cornering the wounded Bigfoot in an alley and looking down on him and say, book him. And they both seemed more like a skit than a whole movie. And then I had a dream a couple nights later on 125th Street, and there was a black guy walking down the street, and he just seemed so uncomfortable, like he didn't belong there. And the way you realize things in dreams without them being dramatized, I realized, well, of course he's alienated. He's an alien. He's not from this planet, and he's trying to figure everything out. And I said, well, there's something. And I kind of combined the three tones of those dreams together. And so literally at this lunch we had to commiserate about the money falling apart from Mate One, I said, well, I have $300,000 in the bank. I have an idea I think that could be made for that well. And Maggie said, well, it's going to be winter pretty soon. I said, you start producing, I'll start writing. And 6 weeks later, we were shooting this. So.
Wow. How long was the script?
The script was, 115 pages.
Oh, it was.
Or something
A
like
normal script.
Yeah. I had a funny incident. I was, to make the money to do this, I was at that time writing the script for Gene Owl's Clan of the Cave Bear and the sequel, Valley of Horses, which they never made. And they flew me out to the West Coast to have a meeting first class. And there sitting next to me out of Newark Airport is Paul Newman. And I'm writing and I'm writing and writing. And some producer from Playboy Productions, which only lasted for a couple of years, who I'd met at some point, came over and started talking. Oh, you're trying to write a screenplay in one flight? And I said, yeah. And I don't know Paul Newman, so I don't introduce this guy, because that's what he came up for, is to be introduced to Paul Newman. So he goes back to his seat, pissed off at me. And Paul Newman turns to me and says, oh, God, you're a screenwriter. I'm so relieved. I kept seeing you write brother, brother, brother. I thought you were a religious fanatic. And I had a whole flight next to you. So anyway.
Well, the results of all this dreaming and machination we're about to present, thank you so much. And
thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you.